Hey everyone, me Kevin here. Earlier I made a video where I talked about how historically, after 700 years of studying pandemics, we tend to see that natural interest rates and inflation come down, and this is the exact opposite response of what happens after wars. In fact, in both cases, wages go up, but rates and inflation tends to trend lower, much lower in fact, after pandemics. But not immediately after pandemics, more like 5 to 20 years after pandemics, and continue to remain low for up to 40 years after pandemics. A lot of the well, I shouldn't say a lot. There were some comments with multiple upvotes in the comment section though, wondering, but Kevin, is this time different because we've printed more money than we have in the past? And the study itself actually gives us an answer. Will more money printing, at least the money printing that we have done now, lead to an additional collapse, or what kind of risks would we expect to our economy after the amount of money printing that we have done to bail ourselves out of this pandemic? And what's worse, printing money after a pandemic or printing money after a war? First, it's worth noting that fiat has been around for hundreds of years. And every fiat that has ever existed before has essentially collapsed and gotten destroyed at some point. So the dollar's days are probably numbered, but those days might be many years out. And by many years, I mean potentially more than our lifetimes. Now, I don't know. I don't personally foresee a massive dollar collapse within the near future, but hey, that's me taking a stand. And I don't know, but I tell you, I'll be the first to tell you if I see the cracks unfolding, and I'm always looking for cracks. And there are some things that are slightly concerning in our market right now, specifically with how much debt has been how much money has been printed. Most measures of why we have too much debt, or I should say the most commonly referenced measure when it comes to why we have too much debt, is the percentage of debt that we have to GDP. And if you want to look this up, type this into Google, St. Louis Fred, like the name Fred, and then type in debt to GDP USA. And I'll show you exactly what you're going to get, and we're going to look at it here together. All right, we're going to go ahead and scroll over here. Federal debt, total public debt as a percentage of gross domestic product. So the sum of all goods and services transacted in our country. And as you can see, our total debt is at a current percentage of about 127% of GDP. This is extremely high. In fact, this chart does not go back as far as, well, ideally it would, but the last time we had debt this high was right after World War II. And this is actually a really interesting reference, because after or during a war, you would expect that a lot of money would be printed so that we can sustain a war fight. We print money, and we use that to fund a war. Now, mechanics of that aside, we end up with a lot of debt to GDP. Over time, that can, what we like to say, inflate away. That is, that old debt becomes much less valuable over time as long as the economy is growing faster than the rate of growth of our debt. And that's exactly what happened after World War II. In fact, after World War II, we never paid off our wartime debt. Today, we still technically have some leftover wartime debt, but it just became increasingly irrelevant because you could see even the amount of debt that we had in the 1970s is a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of debt that we have now. And numerically, this number has exploded as well because, well, right now our economy is way larger than what it used to be back in the 70s or the 50s or the 60s. And so obviously having a debt to GDP of about 127% is really, really high. And so the Federal Reserve tells us, hey, well, what we should focus on now, because yes, our debt to GDP is so high, what we should focus on instead is our total debt payments as a percentage of GDP instead. And this gives a little bit more of a perspective of, oh, okay, so how much are we actually spending on all this debt that we have because interest rates are lower? And so what this means is in 1960, for example, we spent 1.28% of our GDP on debt. So for example, if I type in 0.00128 times $550 billion, That means we spent about $7.04 billion on servicing our debt in 1960. That's just a quick way to do the math on this. And as you can see, even though our total debt has ballooned like crazy, we're actually at a relative low in terms of how much of our GDP we're spending on servicing our debt. In fact, we had much larger debt loads in the 1980s through about 95. We had a much larger debt service payment because interest rates were higher back then, and our debt, therefore, was more of a burden to us relative to our GDP. So maybe the Federal Reserve is right. Maybe our debt is not so horribly unsustainable because our interest rate payments aren't that terrible right now. Now, some like to say this is just the Federal Reserve redefining how things actually work, and we shouldn't be playing the game like this at all. We should just be focusing on this chart right here, which is a lot more scary. And so I suppose it depends on which side of the aisle you're on in terms of what you want to argue. I personally look at both of these factors and I go, okay, yeah, look, this is unsustainable, right? But we did go into a pandemic, and Keynesian economics would call for lots of money printing during a pandemic. So this is pretty typical. And the fact that interest rates are low is good, but the issue is then what happens when interest rates start going up. But consider this, even if our debt payments doubled, the amount of debt that we had to pay doubled, we'd still only be at roughly 1992 levels. So we've been there before in terms of paying that much debt as a percentage of our GDP. So these are two important graphs to pay attention. And the good news is this is slowly ticking down again, and hopefully it doesn't keep skyrocketing to the moon. Obviously, we'll see what ends up happening with the amount of stimulus that ends up getting injected via the next stimulus packages. That could obviously lead to another spike over here, which will lead to some heart palpitations. But what does that same study that we referred to earlier say about this? Because they actually talked about this as well. Take a look at this. Debt sustainability. While the short-run fallout from pandemics looks similar to other economic disasters, large and sudden declines in economic activity, the medium to long-run economic consequences after a pandemic are staggeringly different, as we have shown. That is, pandemics, remember, that natural rate of interest goes down substantially. And these differences matter for policymakers. In any abrupt shutdown or downturn, the textbook response is to either borrow to smooth the shock or to pursue aggressive stimulative fiscal policy to counter the shock. We had both of these, borrowing and stimulus, right? Both will likely lead to a rapid buildup of public debt. Correct, we did see that. However, the sustainability of such debt depends crucially on the type of economic disaster confronted. And this chart is actually really useful because what this chart right here tells us is it tells us the natural rate line of what the natural interest rate is in the economy minus the growth rate. So if we have lots of growth after a pandemic, the blue line, and the growth is greater than what our interest rates are, then we'll have less of a debt burden because we're growing more than our debts are growing, right? And this particular research indicates that generally after pandemics, you might start with a little bit more burden of debt, but that actually lowers as your economy begins to grow again, which is quite the opposite of what you see after wars. So this is why comparing to World War II is actually quite different than when you compare to other pandemics. Now, I'll go back over here to look at the way they worded the conclusion because it's a little bit different. All right, so they say here, if this difference becomes more negative, it is easier to sustain higher levels of debt. In other words, the more down that line was, which the blue line was down for pandemics, the easier the debt is to sustain. So in other words, war debt is worse, pandemic debt better. As they say, once again, we see that pandemics and wars have different consequences in respect to this as well. Figure 3D, which we just showed, shows that in the aftermath of pandemics, R minus G becomes slightly negative by about 50 basis points around the 20-year mark before returning back to equilibrium, which would be as if the pandemic never happened. Anyway, so this, to me, is really interesting because now, if you haven't watched the first video, I encourage you to watch that because that was a really good one too. And I know this is more detailed, which I like going into the details. Those of you in my courses, you know that. You know it's like, oh man, now we're gonna actually learn some crap here. That's why I like doing my courses, and that's why I love them so much. But anyway, yeah, this is actually really interesting because it tells us, look, first of all, our debt as a percentage of GDP in terms of our payments is not that high. It's not as high as it has been in the past. Debt as a percentage of GDP in total is very, very high. It's a scary graph, right? But when we frame it properly with what interest rates are, and we frame it with regard to how pandemics usually respond to debt sustainability, I actually don't believe that the amount of money printing we've done is horribly bad. I think it's potentially excessive. I think if we kept printing, it would quickly become excessive. Like, we're not on a sustainable path, in my opinion. I think if we printed what we did and we're done, you know, maybe we even, you know, stopped now, like no more, that's okay. You know, do I think we can squeeze another $4 trillion stimulus package in? You know, that's when things start getting a little bit more blurry. So we'll see. Not trying to get political, I'm just saying, like, we see how the market's responding. We see how the economy is functioning at the moment with the amount of debt that we've already acquired. And we have some history to help guide us. I don't know about loading on too much more, though, at this point. But anyway, hopefully this provides you a little bit of insight on debts and hopefully assuages, whatever, some fears I might have. Anyway, I'm gonna go now. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.